Tucker. He sang for the Met for almost 35 years and was the namesake of the Metropolitan Opera. Well, we don't have Richard Tucker of the Metropolitan Opera Company, but we do have our own Richard Tucker. Dick Tucker is Professor Emeritus of Psychology, and he is a founding director of the Initiative on Aging and Longevity at UCF, where he served since 1972. And just by way of contrast, when Dick came to UCF, there were 5,000 students. And today, of course, we have 61,000 students in varying stages of engagement at the university. Dick received his PhD from Emory University in developmental psychology. In addition to his traditional academic responsibilities, he chaired the Department of Psychology for 15 years, and for that we take our hats off for him, because being a department chair truly is the least desirable job at our university. Dick is also one of the inspirations behind the Learning Institute for Elders at UCF, and he's still very actively engaged with that program, as he is in the community. And I have a long bio on him, but so many of us here know Dick Tucker that I'm going to step aside because he has a lot to share with us today, and ask you to join me in welcoming our guest speaker today, Dr. Richard Tucker.
It was mute. I do want to thank Manuel, who helped me get set up and gave me the probably most important advice in terms of using this, and particularly this lavalier microphone, because I like to move when I speak. He says, remember to turn it off when you go to the bathroom. I am happy to be back here. Bobby Lyons, I think, was the first one to drag me in here to speak. I think it was to a luncheon, and I spoke several times, and I think a dinner, such. But it's been a while since I've done that. So when Aaron asked me if I would like to speak here, I said, oh, of course, I'd love that. I said, however, I've already spoken to this group. And of course, the standard response to that usually, oh, well, they will have forgotten it all by now. What I want to try to do today is cover a really big topic. I guess I hit this. Well, that's it. And it could be any of those titles. And I've used all those titles. In fact, I was talking to someone the other day, and they said, you do a lot of workshops out in the community, and see all these different titles. Boy, how do you prepare all that? And I said, I only have one presentation. I have different titles for it. Oh, okay. Now, some issues to keep in mind. There is the, quote, elephant in the room. What would that be? Alzheimer's disease. And more specifically, am I going to get dementia? We're at an age where that is often being processed. Our loved ones, neighbors, friends have dealt with this very devastating disease. And I will talk about it, but I'm going to talk about it more from the aspects of what might we be able to do to forestall the onset of dementia. So I'll talk briefly about the role of genetics. I'm not a geneticist, but a lot of people say, well, there's really not anything I can do. It's all in the genes. In fact, a report just came out this week of an experimental medication that is designed and will be used in an experimental fashion with people who have a particular marker, an apolipoprotein E marker, and therefore are at risk. It doesn't mean they're going to get it. They're at risk. There is more than just genetics. So when I talk about brain wellness, I'm talking about basically lifestyle issues. And as a psychologist, that's what I'm interested in. You know, what can I do? Does it make a difference? What are your issues? What kinds of questions do you have? I mean, I'm sure all of you could have been somewhere else, although not with as as you all have. But what are things that you're concerned about? Yeah, Rick? Yeah. Good, that's good. That's classic Rick. Well, I'm going to very quickly go through certain aspects of this, particularly in talking about dementia and specifically Alzheimer's disease, and focus on the what we call the protective factors. So this is kind of an outline. I'll talk very briefly about brain basics, because that's really what we're talking about, the wellness of the brain. We'll talk about normal versus abnormal, and talk about dementia as a symptom. This is a very important distinction that I think you need to appreciate. We'll talk very briefly about differential diagnosis. That's what doctors do. You go in with a symptom, and what's causing it? Is it this? Is it that? And so they give certain tests. Well, the same thing is true when you come in with a cognitive problem. Unfortunately, it's not as easy to do that. And what I want to show you, I'm in and out here, remember is that all Alzheimer's disease, which is the leading cause of dementia, is dementia. Not all dementia is Alzheimer's disease. This is not just a semantic issue. It's a very important issue. And I'll spend some time talking about treatable causes of dementia. I'll talk briefly about risk factors and focus on one particular area of that. And I want to talk about protective factors. And when we talk about risk factors and protective factors, I'm not talking that these are the things that cause dementia. These are the things that prevent dementia. Anytime I hear the word prevent dementia, I shudder, even if it is Dr. Oz. We know of nothing that prevents that you do this, but what we do know is that when you look at groups of people who do certain things, there is a difference between those who do those things and those who do not in terms of their incidence of dementia. And of course, the ingredients of brain wellness. And a term that you may not have heard before, how do we build cognitive reserve? Now, we're all of an age where we know that physically our capabilities are not what they were in our youth, or even maybe 20 years ago, or whatever. But we know that there's some things that we can do that will build physical reserve. Well, we think that there are things that can be done to build cognitive reserve. So quickly, and I want to thank Rob Cohen, who is the neuropsychologist in charge of the Memory Disorder Clinic at Orlando Health, for loaning me his slides on this. we're talking about a fairly small part of the body, but which has different parts, some dealing with the wiring. The center part deals with processing and is the relay station of the brain. Your brain only weighs 2 to 4 pounds. But it's composed of 85% water and fat. So if you're a little bit overweight, you can, no. However, this small 2 to 4 pound thing uses 20 to 30% of our daily calories and is very dependent on blood flow, continuous blood flow, and a lot, a high percentage given its size. Your brain runs on glucose, oxygen, and stimulation. And that's, of course, one of the keys to brain wellness. And your brain never sleeps, is always active. Now, they're estimated to be 100 billion nerve cells, each connected to thousands of other nerve cells. There's all this interconnectedness. So you have the synapses, that's where they connect. And you're talking about 150 trillion, over 150 trillion. I can't even conceptualize what that is except in terms of national debt. And the connections in the brain are dependent on use it or lose it. And we know from experimental research with animals that exposing an old rat to a stimulating environment results in more brain connections. Now we've always kind of, not always, we knew that back in the 50s through developmental research, again with animals, and that a stimulating environment enriched the brains of young. And that, in fact, is part of the research that gave rise to the Head Start program. And nobody did research with old rats because we didn't even think about it, that there was a possibility. And this process by which these connections take place, we call it arborization, and just think tree branches. And with dementia, what happens is those branches begin to fall away. Now, very quickly, this view of the brain with the nucleus, cell body, and such. The really important part are those branches that I was talking about. And that is what grows, continues to grow, and requires good nutrients and stimulation and blood flow. So let me talk very quickly about normal versus, there is actually a term for what we all experience. Somebody was just asking me, are you going to talk about what happens when you go into a room and forget why you went in there? I know none of you have had that experience. I mean, it's called the hereafter. You know, what am I in here after? You know, but there's actually, this is the scientific nerve, age-consistent memory decline. And that refers to these intermittent, mild memory changes that is not greater than expected for age and which does not impact activities of daily living. Okay? That's important. Assuming, this is, when it's not greater than expected for age, there are age norms. As we age, we lose certain aspects of physical functioning, for sure, but also some aspects of our mental functioning, particularly speed of response. I've just started playing a brain game, Lumosity, which hopefully I'll be able to talk more about. And the neat thing about that is it attracts your performance, but it also shows how you are doing relative to your age group. And I think it's in 5-year increments. And I was, hey, I'm doing pretty well. Let me see how a 40-year-old does. Oh, well, I'm still doing pretty good for my age. And the term I just love benign senescent forgetfulness, and Bobby might remember that. Believe it or not, that's what normal aging changes in cognition were called. Benign senescent forgetfulness. Wonderful term. It's benign. Isn't that good? Isn't benign good? Senescent. It's a term we don't really use or even maybe know what it means, but the term senescence is a developmental term in the same way as we have adolescence. Senescence refers to that period of life toward the last third of our life. And forgetfulness, does anybody have problems telling somebody, oh, I get this problem with forgetfulness? No. You probably would, oh, I think I've got dementia. Forgetfulness is okay. It's a benign, senescent, normal process. And I keep waiting for, my wife threatens, in one of these birthdays, I'm going to get this as a bumper sticker. Yeah. But if you're in a group, social group, and you have a lapse of memory, you can't pull a word out that you want, or you can't, here's this person coming toward you who you know and you cannot remember their name. So instead of saying, oh my memory's, oh, it must be that darn benign senescent forgetfulness. And whoever you say that to will not talk to you for the rest of the evening. Now, there's some non-scientific terminology. CRS. I'm hearing enough laughter that you already know what it means. I had never seen this before until I went to Atlantic City in the midst of a trip up north. And of course, Atlantic City has a lot of older adults playing the casinos. And I saw this on hats, T-shirts. Now, there are a couple other terms. This is the student's favorite term. If you ask the student, oh, that was just a brain fart. You know. And they have them, incidentally. What's this? Oh, just what do we want? Better memory. Now, we all laugh when we see that. But every time we laugh, we're reinforcing the notion that we can't remember anything. And that is not true. So, in terms of changes that are normal, retrieving things that you want when you want it. And eventually it comes to you. Now, it may be 3 o'clock in the morning when you, oh yes. You need more intentional processing. If you go to an area, they used to call them malls, but a place where there are a lot of stores, and you park, and you go into a store, particularly a store that has multiple entrances, and then you come out, and you're not even sure which entrance you came in on. But the one thing you need to do is be very intentional. Where did I park? What are the areas here? What side of the building did I go in? You know, which probably should be the side that I come out. Right? But that's intentional. We have to do this more intentionally as we get older. And we need to use more cues to remember something in the future. And I bet we all do that in different ways, but thank God for sticky notes. Okay? Now, the problem with a sticky note is you need to put it somewhere that it reminds you. So often I will go out to the car if it's something that I need, and I'll put it on the steering wheel, or I'll put it on the glass, so that when oh yeah, that's what I'm supposed to be doing. And what we're talking about is the role of cueing. Now, we do know that in terms of free recall, just remembering things, if I were to give you a list of words and ask you, okay, now write down as many as you can remember, you will not do as well as a younger person. There's variability with that, but overall, clearly, as you age, your free recall performance decreases. And that's a lot of the research that was done compared young and old on things like that. And that's what gave rise to the idea that is, as you get older, your memory goes, right? And these are the greatest age differences if you were to count the number of words recalled. The biggest age differences are with free recall, okay? But then there's something called cued recall, where you get a little help, and that triggers something that leads you to the answer. Now, the interesting thing is everybody improves with cueing, but older adults improve a little bit more, and basically the difference between young and old begins to diminish. And then finally, you've got recognition memory. So if I had given you this list of words, and on the thing were words like Alaska, lion, grandmother, and we went through this whole thing. And then I come back and I said, now I'm going to give a bunch of words. You tell me whether or not this was one of the words. I'm not asking you to remember all the words. Just tell me whether or not this was one of the words. So, Alaska, tiger, grandmother, grandma, okay. Actually, I did that wrong. I was supposed to say grandfather. We have no problem doing that, okay? There are virtually no age differences in recognition memory. What does that tell us? Also, how many of you have had that you hear something, you smell something, you see something, you feel something, and it triggers a memory of something you have not thought about in years, literally? Often something from childhood, or how many of you have had that experience? How do you explain that? What does it tell us? It's simple. It's still in there. And that is not an insignificant thing, because in fact, people with dementia will lose the ability, particularly with new information, for it to still be in there. You can do a lot of cueing. They even will have trouble with recognition. But if your memory is normal, you still have it in there. You just need the right cues. You need to rearrange your environment so that you get the cues. Yes?
So basically, cueing will help us access.
Yes. Right. Right. It's the file cabinet analogy. And I tell my students, I said, you think you're so much smarter than older adults. And I said, one of the reasons you may do better on certain things is that your files are not full. Okay. And in fact, how many of you have ever used, because it's time for honesty here, how many of you have ever used that term, senior moment? Okay, I want to kind of get that out of your vocabulary, if you will, because I think it does reinforce this notion that, it's shot. So next time you just say, oh, my files are full. Okay. Oh, this is, I'm not going to go through this. I have like 20 different things. How many of you can answer that? What did he leave behind? Silver bullet. Well, of course, there's a movie out now, so that's maybe not fair. How many of you had thought about the silver bullet recently? This is old stuff, but it's still in there. Now, other changes that are normal, forgetting where you left something, but how do we find it eventually? We retrace our steps. And also, one of the reasons we forget things is that we are interrupted. And when you're interrupted, it cuts, and so you have to recreate that pattern. Yes? Yeah, and that's a perfect way. That's a perfect way to use cueing. You put it right where it'll be useful to you. It also takes, particularly with new learning, takes more repetitions and more time to learn new things. But it isn't just repetition and time. It's the meaningfulness of the material. Older adults can learn meaningful material very quickly. The kind of stuff that's given in a psych lab, they have trouble with that. This doesn't have any meaning. Nonsense syllables. I understand why they use them, but who cares about nonsense syllables? And then you have these other glitches that I think our problem more is not that our memory is really vanishing, but that it's embarrassing. When that person you know is coming toward you and they're getting closer and closer and you still cannot remember their name, you're embarrassed. You're embarrassed by that. And it doesn't mean that that impairs your everyday functioning. They're probably having that same experience. So, actually, this was put on me now. That's why we have name tags, right? What's this doing in here? Whatever happened to our sexual relations? I don't know. I don't even think we got a Christmas card from them this year. That really doesn't have much to do with the topic, but we're about to move into abnormal changes where it gets a little hairier, so I just want to lighten things a little bit. Mild cognitive impairment. You're hearing this term more and more. That refers to changes in cognitive function, still not seriously impairing everyday functioning, but occurring with greater frequency than would be age normal. And this is important because there is a higher probability of developing a progressive dementia, particularly if it's what's called amnestic MCI. It's a memory issue. But having mild cognitive impairment doesn't mean you're going to become, you will have a progressive dementia. It becomes a risk factor. And I think we're getting earlier and earlier diagnosis, and if you've kept up with even just the newspapers, they're finding out newer and newer ways to try to diagnose particularly amyloid plaques in the brain, which is part of what is considered to cause Alzheimer's disease. And it does allow for greater involvement of the person in the planning. But for me, greater opportunities for intervention. And it's both drug treatment. Remember, I talked about this thing, it just came out this week, where they're trying to find people who are at risk genetically and give them drugs. Unfortunately, so much of our intervention is drug related because guess what? Who has the money to fund that kind of research? But I think it's just as important to look at lifestyle changes. And unfortunately, we're just starting to do that. Very quickly, there's a thing called preclinical Alzheimer's disease. This is scary in that they are now finding certain biochemical or physiological indicators that are related to the later onset of a dementia when there are no symptoms. Okay. That again is a terribly ageist joke, but we're going to talk about dementia very quickly. And the important thing is to think about it as a cluster of symptoms, not as a disease entity. Those symptoms obviously involve memory impairment, but it's memory impairment plus. If a person just has memory impairment and there are no other cognitive difficulties, that is not dementia. So you have these other important cognitive functions. And they must cause significant impairment in social occupational functioning and represent, this is important, a decline from previous functioning. Okay, and it's not, and it's typically a more noticeable decline, although Alzheimer's disease can be much more gradual. There are over 50 different causes of dementia. That's why it's important. And I'm not going to go through this. These are the types of dementia, Alzheimer's being the leading one. Some of you may have heard about diffuse Lewy body disease. That's something we've known more about in the last 20 years. And then there are other rare diseases. Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. Does anybody know what that is? Mad cow disease. Yeah. This is what I want to talk about. Of those 50 different causes, let's look at some that are treatable. Now, that's only estimated to be 5 to 10% of the dementias, meaning that 90 to 95% of the dementias are currently progressive and not treatable. So you say, oh, 5 to 10%? That's not much. It's not much as a percentage. How many cases of Alzheimer's disease do they say there is in the United States? What's the estimate? 5 million. In the state of Florida, 400,000 to 500,000. Take 5 to 10% of those numbers. Okay? And it can be something as simple as a vitamin B12 deficiency. But if you don't look for it, and particularly, the thing that I'm more worried about is the older the person showing these symptoms, the greater the leap to diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease, because it is an age-related disease. But who's checking for these things? High homocysteine levels, low folic acids. These are things that we know are related to incidence of dementia, electrolyte depletion, treatable head trauma. So tumors, obviously. This is why they do brain scans early on. They don't do brain scans to say, oh, it's Alzheimer's disease. Now, there are some techniques using positive emission tomography or scans that are showing perhaps some early indicators, but it's still in a very experimental stage. How many of you have heard of normal pressure hydrocephalus? More of you need to know about it because it is another age-related disease, and it refers to the buildup of fluid in the brain. What are the symptoms? The dementia symptoms. I do a lot of workshops around. I love to talk about this. And I was at Village on the Green, and mentioned this. And at the end of it, this fellow comes up to me. He says, I'm 86 years old. 6 months ago, everybody, including me, thought I had Alzheimer's disease. I couldn't do this, I couldn't do that, couldn't do that. But fortunately, I got referred to a neurologist who did the testing and found out it was normal pressure hydrocephalus, which can be shunted into the stomach to relieve this. The longer that goes untreated, the more problems there can be. And then he looks at me and says, I'm back. That's one that gets the hairs up in the back of my neck when I think about it. And you're seeing more about this. Lyme disease, I won't talk about, although some of you who are from up north, yeah. I'm not sure. Of course, spinal taps are sometimes used, but I think it can be done through imaging. I don't know for sure. Now, other treatable causes. Now, I want you to think about these. Drug effects. We represent 12 to 13% of the population, 65 and over. We take 30 to 35% of prescription drugs. And the same overuse of over-the-counter and, quote, natural remedies. We know that there can be what's called polypharmacy and the effects of drugs that interact. And those of you taking drugs, particularly if you're taking multiple drugs, my guess is they were prescribed by more than one physician. And if you don't do a good job communicating, or they don't do a good job asking, they may not be aware of that issue. Alcohol. Alcohol by itself and with drugs often represent with dementia symptoms. Now, moderate drinking is recommended. It's really actually recommended sometimes as a protective factor. But what's moderate? For a woman, one drink, glass of wine, bottle of beer, whatever the normal shot. For men, 2. That's what's considered moderate drinking. And I'm not talking about people who really have an alcohol problem and really begin to have dysfunction. That is more likely to be Korsakoff syndrome, which is a killing of the liver, I believe. I'm talking about just using more alcohol than you should be. And it may be something that you're not increasing your alcohol content. You've been able to function well with that 3, maybe 4 drinks. Now, those 3 to 4 drinks have the impact of 6 to 8 drinks because of differences in the ability of the body with age to process chemicals, the liver and the kidneys. And we, in fact, have something called alcohol-induced dementia. And then finally, depression, called pseudodementia. I'll quickly go through this. This whole issue of differential diagnosis, multidisciplinary assessment, which is available through the memory disorder clinics throughout the state, and there are about 15 or 16 of them. The nearest one for us is Orlando Regional. There are also some private, I think Compass is one in the area. You really need to do all of those things. And after you've done all of those things, if you've ruled out other possibilities, then by exclusion, it's listed as possible or probable Alzheimer's. The diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease is typically done by autopsy. It could be done by brain biopsy, but the last time I checked, I think that's somewhat invasive. What's the reality of diagnosis? Who diagnoses most of the folks? Your primary care physician. Now, if you're happy with that, and they don't go through this and don't refer you, You go in with heart symptoms to your primary care physician, what do you expect? You're going to be referred to a cardiologist, right? Now, they may do an EKG in the office or something, but they're going to refer you to a specialist. You go in with cognitive symptoms, why aren't you being referred to a specialist, a neurologist, preferably a behavioral neurologist, who works with a neuropsychologist? Okay. So I really can get on the soapbox about that. These are just things that we know about age. Age is the leading risk factor, but it doesn't mean that you will have dementia if you just get old enough. And I mentioned Jeanne Calment. How many of you have heard of Jeanne Calment? She was a French woman who lived to be 121 and 3 months or 4 months. And she had some visual impairment, she had some hearing problems, mobility issues, sharp as a tack, as they say. So it's not the inevitable consequence of aging. The genetics part of it, the clear findings are with early onset. This is occurring before 60. And also this apolipoprotein, there are these markers, the 3 markers. If you have 4s, it increases your risk factor. And this is the population that they're now looking at intervening with drugs. And what you need to know with any genetics is that it's the interaction of the environment with the genetic factors. Now, this is what I want you to look at in terms of risk factors. And this comes from more recent findings, but high cholesterol, diabetes, metabolic syndrome. How many of you have heard of metabolic syndrome? It's a combination of things. Okay? Inflammation that is found through C-reactive protein test. Okay? Whoop. The arteries. Yeah. What do these all have in common? Yeah, there are lifestyle issues. Aren't these often the same risk factors for coronary disease? They're all related to cardiovascular issues. And what we're finding is that the same advice we give to people in terms of nutrition and exercise and such applies to brain wellness as well as to physical wellness. Now, I've already talked about that. Protective factors, nutrition, exercise, stress management, because stress releases cortisol from the adrenal gland. Cortisol does not do well, particularly for the aging brain. So stress management ought to be part of it. We do know that people with higher levels of intelligence and higher levels of education have lower risk for developing dementia. That should be good news for folks in here. The other thing is engagement in life. And that's, right now you're engaging. This is one type of engagement in life. How many of you volunteer? Can you imagine the nonprofits in the state of Florida operating without you guys? Okay. But volunteering, and there have been research studies, is really beneficial to the person. Because one of the things, you're doing something that's, particularly if you're doing something that you feel is meaningful, but you're also interacting with people, the social relationships. Now, in the same way that we build a physical reserve, as I said before, we can build cognitive reserve, and that decreases the probability of cognitive decline. Oh, how many of you have heard of the Brain Fitness Club? This is a program actually for people with early diagnosis. And it's run at the Methodist Church on Interlochen. Winter Park Methodist Church. And that's their, I think they've changed it recently, but I love that symbol. This is another one. Actually, my wife told me, don't use that one. It looks like a weightlifter bending over. You know. Now, these variety of things in terms of lifestyle, but another one is self-efficacy. Self-efficacy. It's a term that may not be familiar to you. It's a very important psychological term. It refers to the sense that you feel you can do something, that you have some power over what happens. You can guide your own life. And then there's ageism. All those jokes we've laughed at, many of them were ageist. And we don't think about ageism. How many of you have heard of the term ageism? Good, I'm glad to see more hands going up. Often in groups of older adults. What? You've heard of racism, sexism, same dynamics, same dynamics. The intellectually stimulating activities. Oh, going back to self-efficacy, I said compare UCF students to older adults. When I would teach the psychology of aging class, I would ask them, how many of you have ever forgotten where you parked your car? All the hands go up. How many of you have ever forgotten where you left your car keys? All the hands go up. How many of you have gone into a room and, what did I come in here for? All the hands go up. What's the difference between them and us? They don't worry about it. So these other things that travel is wonderful. Even if you're learning something about another language, enough to, for me, the important term in German was ein Bier bitte. You know. So you learn these little things. But travel is just expanding the mind. And you can do a lot of travel if you're place-bound on the internet. And I'm sure all of you do things that are, anybody want to share some things that you all do for brain wellness? Bobby? Well, that's good. I mean, that's Bobby's workshop. Getting cortisol out of your body, okay? So anyway, I'm preaching to the choir here. But you need to hear that. You need to hear that because you live in an ageist society that is telling you, constantly giving you signals of how bad it is to be old, and particularly as it relates to memory. So I know I'm well over my time. And Aaron?
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
You mentioned the brain that doesn't sleep during the non-REM sleep. In what sense is the brain not sleeping?
Well, I'm not a physiological psychologist. I probably shouldn't have even put that up because I can't answer that question. Okay. Probably Dr. Cohen could. Yes?
What, in your opinion, is the value of these brain games that are being sold for TV or your
Actually,
Atari or whatever?
Had I been able to control what I say and how much I say, I would have shown you some of these brain games. There are a number of them out there, and that question about how good are they is an important one. I think the one you're hearing about the most now is Lumosity. And the good thing about Lumosity is that it was developed by neuroscientists and psychologists. And it's funny, as a psychologist, I go on there and say, oh, I know what this is measuring. these are things that, some of them are actually used in neuropsychological testing. But you can go and they pace you on this in giving you the test. Now it costs to get into that aspect of the program, but they're doing a lot of research on the effectiveness of that. But there's not a great deal of controlled research on the effectiveness. As far as I'm concerned, in a spirit of great optimism, I became a lifetime member.
Hello. You hear so much about Lipitor and the bad effects of it, but your doctor says the bad effects, the good effects are better than the bad. And I wanted to ask you also, when you mentioned the vitamin B12, there's so many different parts of vitamin B12. How do we know which ones to buy?
Well, you can ask your pharmacist, I think. But if you really have a vitamin B12 deficiency, it's not how many capsules you take. You're going to need an intravenous injection of B12. Yeah.
You mentioned that there were some markers that could be found for someone who has genetic markers.
Right.
And how do you go about finding that?
You have to do genetic testing. And I,
Go to someone that
right, Orlando Regional did do it at one time, and then they stopped doing it because they felt that they could not adequately advise people. This was right after the findings, those first findings came out. Yeah, it's done through blood test and the genetic analysis, but it shows that it's a risk factor, but it doesn't show that it causes.
I understand.
Yeah.
That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Dr. Tucker. I'm Alice Dexter, and I am a medical advocate. I still am working.
Ah, wonderful.
And I want to say that Luminosity is, for those of us that have our iPhones, it's on. It's a free app.
Yes.
And I will tell you what
Oh,
I
I didn't
do.
know, a free app.
Free
Now,
app.
But, yeah, to get access to
To
it,
get
but
access.
probably
well,
not
there's some
into the-
games, but they
yeah.
have a,
Right.
I just pulled it up for you.
Right.
But I'll tell you what I do when I'm waiting in a doctor's office with one of my 80-year-old patients. I play Sudoku on my phone.
Yeah.
And I want to make another comment about when I'm looking at things for my patients. Anesthesia, we never discuss anesthesia. And that is a very important piece of our picture when a patient's in the hospital and we are looking at what's going on for them postoperatively. We need to be looking at anesthesia and not be calling dementia out to my patients or any other patients that are in the hospital until we are looking at that being dissipated out of their bodies,
Right.
and we're looking at reviewing their medications
Right.
postoperatively.
And there's as you know, a difference between dementia and delirium.
And when they call,
Yeah.
when they call me up from the hospital, my patient is post-op, I'm going to say, we need to look at some other things like UTIs and whatever, and don't be
Yeah.
talking to me about dementia with my patient.
Right. And again, the older the person, the more likelihood there are going to be side effects of anesthesia.
Why do we forget people's names more than we forget other things?
You typically, first of all, we can forget the names of family members. If you have, I've got 4 grandkids, and I'll call the oldest grandchild by my oldest son's name, but as soon as I do it, I realize, oh wait, no. But people that you do not see frequently are the ones that are harder to remember. But this is.
Is there a part of the brain that deals with names that's different?
Yes, yes. But there are ways to get people, this Lumosity thing, in fact, has one of the games in there is learning people's names. And it does it in the context of being a waiter. And you're serving them. And then they ask for the bill. And you have to put their name in or you don't get a tip.
When you're talking about names, if you have several children and they're disturbing you, you'll call them anything.
Yeah.
However, did you know that living is dangerous to your health?
Since I've always had trouble with names, I just have given it a lot of thought and wondered if, when you said that thing about nonsense syllables, that you have trouble remembering
Yeah.
them. And to my mind, that's what names are, because they're
Well,
not linked to, if you
right,
think car, you
right.
know what it's got.
Right.
Whereas Kathy could
Yeah.
be any shape and size. and-
Right, and if you think of the file analogy again, all you have is a file called names. And that's, you know, what distinguishes one from the other. Yeah,
What could be a good resource? I live with my 87-year-old mother. So what could be a good resource for me to begin more self-efficacy for her and as a resource for if a family member does have dementia, what do we do when they don't remember? Do we say, oh yes, you know, it's, I don't
Yeah.
want to write, like, do you remember I was born? No.
yeah.
It's not that. I'm just saying, what kind of resources can we offer?
Yeah. I have somewhere in here, whoops. Whoops, there it is. These are just some of the books that are out there. They're now, I need to update that. But Gary Small is the head of aging at UCLA. And he's written a number of books, the memory prescriptions. He also has a program that he's doing research with. Very good, dealing with each aspect that I talked about of brain wellness. If you have a person who is really beginning to show cognitive decline, if it's specific to one thing, you can work on that. But if it's a more general kind of decline, there are resources to at least, like the Alzheimer's Association, or what's used to be called the Alzheimer Resource Center, it's now called the Alzheimer's and Dementia Resource Center, and they can be very helpful.
Are there any foods that you think are particularly good for memory retention? And
French fries.
Yeah. Well, I think the same foods that are recommended for fitness, for physical fitness. There are some chemicals that are marketed as brain chemicals. I haven't seen any of those based on solid research. But now, Dr. Oz may have some suggestions.
I heard a talk recently on Alzheimer's and dementia, and he mentioned that one of the causes of dementia could be painkillers, which is kind of a double bind for old
Yeah.
people that are taking painkillers for
Yeah.
various, really real pain, that it
Yeah.
used some part of the brain. Is that replaceable? Whatever we're killing with the painkillers?
Yeah,
in the
well,
brain.
that's a medical question, as my
Okay.
oldest son likes to continually remind me, I'm not a real doctor. Okay.
Beneficial, or does it just frustrate the person?
Well, it depends on how it's, if this is a person with significant memory problems, it can be frustrating. You do have to know how to introduce these in a kind of gradual format, or it depends on the kind of cueing. It's not unusual, and probably in here, is some of you who may have had loved ones who do develop dementia and have problems finding clothing or using clothing, is labeling drawers. I mean, that's a,
Short-term memory loss, they'll say, what day is it?
yeah, that's a different ballgame, yeah. Well, that's why in memory care units, there'll typically be a board that says, this is whatever day. Okay. And then we're going to be doing, now the person may forget to look at that or not understand what that means, but that's why it's up there.
Ladies and gentlemen, let's put our hands together and thank Dick Tucker.
Oh, yeah, advertisement. Now, not giving talks. We're helping to put on the Paint Out in New Smyrna Beach. If you've been to the Winter Park Paint Out at Pulaski, it's the same type of thing. We invite, this year we'll have 29 professional landscape artists who come in for the week. They're hosted by families, and they will be painting in the National Seashore, the Canaveral National Seashore, the New Smyrna side of that. And then they will be also every day giving demonstrations or workshops that are free. One of which I know is scheduled on Monday on the beach. And it happens to be one of our painters who loves to paint big beach scenes. There's a very interesting twist this year. If you think you would be buying some art, the thing to do is to become an art patron. And at the level of $300 or more, you get a 100% art credit. Most people, well, you misstated that. No, you get 100% art credit, plus tickets to the gala on Saturday night. So anyway, go to friendsofcanaveral.com, and I'll leave some of these around for you.
And ladies and gentlemen, please do remember that our next Lunch and Learn will be October 11th, and we'll have another outstanding faculty representative from UCF, Dr. Kenneth Hansen.
Oh, wow.
Thank you very much for coming today.